The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as Danielle Ross pushed through the ICU doors at 0547, 17 minutes before her shift officially began. She moved like someone who'd learned long ago that arriving early meant choosing your position before the chaos chose it for you. The hallway was empty except for the night shift nurses beginning their handoff, their voices low and practiced, the kind of tired that came from 6 hours of keeping people alive. She didn't greet them. They didn't expect her to. In 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh, Danielle had perfected the art of being present without existing. The locker room smelled like industrial bleach and yesterday's coffee. She opened locker 47 with a key she kept on a carabiner that matched the one hanging in her apartment closet, the one that held nothing but a pair of worn combat boots, the left one still stained dark at the heel. The boots had a name tape, SCPO Ross. A navy trident beneath it. She hadn't looked at them in 14 months. Some mornings that felt like strength. Other mornings it felt like drowning in slow motion. Her scrubs today were navy blue, sized to hide rather than flatter. Her hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it threatened her temples. This was the costume of invisibility, not because she was naturally forgettable, but because she'd trained herself to become that way. Hands that had held trauma shears engraved with a call sign now held a simple stethoscope from the hospital supply closet. She pressed it against her ears and moved toward the ICU. Nurse Chen was already at the central station, her coffee cup steaming in the pre-dawn quiet, and she glanced up as Danielle approached. "Hey, you're early again," Chen said, which was hospital code for, "I've noticed but I'm not going to make it weird. We've got incoming to bed 4. Cardiac patient, military transfer from the VA down in Durham. Colonel level, Delta Force background. Should be here by 0700, maybe sooner." Danielle's hand stilled for exactly 2 seconds. 1. 2. Then she nodded and moved to the bed assignments taped to the whiteboard. Her eye scanned the names without really reading them until she found it. Colonel James Mercer. Helmand Province extraction. Cardiac tamponade suspected. Recovery critical. She didn't know a Colonel Mercer. She'd never met anyone by that name. But she knew that call sign from somewhere 3 years and 4 months ago, from a place that officially didn't exist, from a night when she'd carried a 200-pound man with a collapsed lung and shattered femur through 11 kilometers of hostile territory, and his blood had soaked into her left boot so thoroughly that the stain had never fully washed out. The man had been unconscious the entire extraction, morphine and shock making sure he'd never see her face clearly. She was grateful for it then. She was more grateful for it now. "You okay?" Chen was studying her with the careful attention of someone who'd worked ICU for 15 years and could read the micro-expressions of cardiac nurses the way other people read subtitles. "Fine," Danielle said. "Just thinking about the shift." It was a lie that sounded true because she'd had 3 years to perfect it. Her voice had a quality to it, controlled, deferential, careful. The kind of voice that made doctors feel important and floor nurses feel safe. The kind of voice that made people underestimate you. The morning unfolded with the metronomic precision of hospital protocol. By 0600, the day shift was filtering in. By 0630, beds were being prepped. By 0700, the first of Dr. Vincent Hargrove's residents was presenting cases at rounds, and Danielle was standing against the wall with a chart in her hands, making herself smaller, quieter, less. Dr. Hargrove entered the unit at 0743 like he was descending from Mount Olympus, his white coat pressed with hospital corners, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a general's regalia. He was 51 years old, with the kind of jawline that had probably been impressive in medical school and had aged into something that looked carved from resentment. His eye swept the ICU, beds, machines, monitors, before settling with visible irritation on the fact that his morning rounds would be interrupted by a floor nurse instead of a third-year resident. "Dr. Hargrove," Danielle said quietly, stepping forward with the chart extended. The deferential posture came naturally, she'd been practicing it for 36 months. "Bedford is your new admission. Colonel James Mercer, admitted at 0717 from the VA, cardiac complications post-extraction. BP stable at 118/76, but the chest CT from Durham is concerning for. I'll read the CT myself, thank you. Hargrove cut her off without looking at the chart. His voice had the quality of someone accustomed to interruption being a form of agreement. Has the cardiothoracic team been called? Dr. Patterson called down. He's reviewing films now. Estimated ETA for evaluation is. I didn't ask for your estimation, Hargrove said, finally turning to look at her. His gaze was the kind that tried to diminish through sheer contempt. You're a floor nurse, not a cardiologist. The cardiothoracic surgeon will determine next steps. Your job is observation and reporting. Surely you can manage that. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Around them, the ICU staff shifted in that particular way people do when witnessing disrespect, a collective intake of breath, a sudden interest in computer screens, the careful neutrality of people who weren't sure if defending someone meant volunteering to be next. Danielle's jaw tightened for perhaps a quarter second. Her hands, which had been holding the chart with professional composure, didn't waver. She'd been trained to operate under fire, under enemy interrogation, under the kind of psychological pressure that turned most people into their own worst enemies. A condescending cardiologist in a pressed white coat barely registered on that scale. Understood, doctor, she said, her voice that perfect instrument of subordination. She stepped back, making room for him to approach the bed. Making room for him to feel important. Hargrove swept past her and into bed for without another word, and Danielle watched him approach Colonel Mercer with that particular bedside manner reserved for important patients, the one that involved hand placement and eye contact and the impression of caring deeply while caring not at all. The colonel was still foggy from morphine, his eyes moving with the sluggish quality of someone whose brain was catching up to his body. His right forearm, exposed where the foreline ran to his elbow, bore a tattoo that made Danielle's breathing change by precisely 0.05%. A call sign. Her call sign. The one she'd been given in 2019, the one that had died in a training accident when Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had officially stopped existing. She turned away and returned to the central station, where she pulled up the incoming labs on the computer screen with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned not to feel things in real time. The test results were there, our ejection fraction at 38%. Troponin elevated. Lactate climbing. The cardiac panel was a story of a heart struggling to do its job, and she read it like other people read weather reports, with the acknowledgement that conditions were deteriorating. At 0900, Dr. Patterson from Cardiothoracic called down to report that he'd reviewed the films and wanted to discuss them with Hargrove directly. The conversation happened in the physician's lounge, 3 walls away from where Danielle was monitoring the colonel's vitals. She heard none of it, which meant she missed nothing because she'd already read the films herself, already understood that the cardiac tamponade suspected in the Durham notes had been confirmed by imaging, and already knew that without intervention, the fluid around his heart would compress it until it simply stopped working. By 1100, the colonel's blood pressure had dipped to 104/68. By 1130, it was 98/62. By 1145, the heart monitor was showing the unmistakable pattern of compensatory tachycardia, the body's desperate attempt to push enough blood through a failing pump. Danielle noted it all, charted it all, and said nothing because speaking up in the presence of physicians was the fastest way to be labeled a difficult nurse, a problem nurse, a nurse who needed to remember her scope of practice. At 1200, Hargrove appeared at the central station with his residents orbiting him like satellites, and Danielle reported the vital signs trend with the kind of clinical precision that made clear she understood what was happening, even if she was careful not to explicitly name the crisis forming in bed 4. The labs were 2 hours ago, Hargrove said, waving his hand dismissively. The patient is recovering. Cardiac surgery carries significant risk. We wait for Patterson to finish his review and convene with the surgical team. His pressure's been dropping steadily for the last, Danielle began, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Your job is to monitor and report, Hargrove repeated, his tone suggesting this was a lesson he was growing tired of delivering. Not to interpret. Not to diagnose. Not to second-guess physicians. Report the numbers. We do the medicine. She nodded, accepting the correction with the exact degree of contrition that made it clear she understood the hierarchy, and Hargrove turned away satisfied that order had been restored to his universe. What he didn't see was the way her eyes moved back to the monitor, tracking the numbers the way a sniper tracks wind conditions, understanding them not as data points but as information about what a body was willing to tolerate before it simply quit. At 13:15, the colonel's oxygen saturation began dropping. 96%. 94%. 91%. The monitor beeped its escalating alarm like an animal sensing danger, and Danielle was already moving toward the bed before the sound had finished its first pulse. Her movements were economical, efficient, the movements of someone who'd done this countless times, not in hospitals but in field tents, in moving vehicles, in places where mistakes didn't generate incident reports, they generated casualty bags. She checked the oxygen. The mask was in place. The saturation continued dropping. 88%. 85%. Her hands moved to his chest, feeling for the flutter beneath the skin, and there it was, the faint suggestion of external pressure on the heart itself, the fluid that had been slowly accumulating now pressing down like a hand squeezing a fist. "Get Dr. Hargrove," she said to Chen, her voice having shifted from deferential to something else entirely, something with the weight of command underneath it, though her words remained technically a request. "He's in the lounge," Chen said, already moving. He said not to disturb him. "Now." The word was quiet. It was also not a suggestion. Chen went. Danielle was already pulling open the supplies she would need, already preparing the space, already moving like the nurse costume was falling away and something else, something with 17 years of combat medicine experience, was stepping forward. She opened a sterile field, pulled a 14-gauge needle from the cardiac kit, and positioned herself with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory so deep it existed in her bones, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark she'd learned not in nursing school but in a forward operating base in Helmand Province where staying alive meant knowing exactly where the human body kept its most critical vulnerabilities. Hargrove arrived at Bedford at 13:19, his face already flushed with irritation at being summoned, and he took in the scene with the particular anger of someone watching a subordinate perform without permission. But his anger stalled when he registered what she was doing, the equipment arranged with surgical precision, her hand steady as she prepared to perform a procedure that required not just knowledge but something that couldn't be taught in any classroom, the certainty that you were right. "What are you doing?" His voice came out sharp as broken glass. "Step away from that patient immediately. You are not authorized to." "Cardiac tamponade," Danielle said, her voice entirely absent now of deference. "Ejection fractions at 32%. O2 sat dropping. If we wait for cardiothoracic to set up an operating room, his heart stops in maybe 4 minutes. Maybe 5 if we're lucky. I can do the pericardiocentesis right here." The room had gone very quiet. Even the monitors seemed to sense it, a collective held breath. "You will not," Hargrove said, stepping forward to physically block her path. "That is completely outside your scope of practice. You're a floor nurse, not a physician. I am the attending on this patient, and I am ordering you to step away." Danielle looked at him. Really looked at him. At the hospital badge that meant he'd passed an exam. At the white coat that meant someone had once trusted his judgment. At the watch on his wrist that cost more than her monthly rent, the ring that suggested a family who'd never had to wonder if they belonged anywhere. Then she looked at the monitor. The heart rate was 148. The oxygen was at 77%. The blood pressure had collapsed to 84/52, and the patient's lips were beginning to turn the particular shade of blue that came from a body not getting enough oxygen. Her hands moved. Not because Hargrove had given her permission, but because some things, some crucial, irreplaceable things, were more important than hierarchy. The needle went in at the precise angle, the precise depth, through the pericardial sac with the kind of confidence that could only come from having done it on people who would die if you were wrong. There was a hiss as air escaped, as pressure released, as the fluid that had been crushing the colonel's heart suddenly had somewhere to go. The heart monitor changed. The O2 sat climbed. 79%. 85%. 91%. Sinus rhythm. In the sudden silence that followed, with the colonel's vital signs stabilizing like a prayer answered, Danielle set the needle down with the careful precision of someone who'd just made a decision that was going to change everything. She didn't remove her gloves immediately. She didn't look at Hargrove. She looked only at the monitor, watching the numbers climb back toward normal, watching the patient's color slowly improve from blue to pink. Then she turned, her eyes meeting Hargrove's for the first time without apology, without deference, without the carefully constructed mask of subordination. What he saw in that look was something he'd never expected to find on the face of a floor nurse. Absolute certainty. His pressures stabilized, she said quietly. "You'll want to get cardiothoracic down here now. He's ready for surgery." The morning rounds began like every other morning at Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove leading a procession of residents down the ICU corridor, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to without question. Danielle stood at the colonel's bedside with his chart, noting the pericardial drain output from the previous shift, 180 milliliters of serosanguineous fluid, down from 240 the day before. The trend was positive. The drainage was slowing. The protein concentration in the last sample suggested the acute phase was resolving. She'd run the numbers 3 times, checking her math against the lab values, and the data was clear. When Hargrove reached the bed, she made the mistake of speaking. "Doctor, the drain output is trending down. We might consider adjusting the protocol, reducing the frequency of flushes, maybe transitioning to passive drainage by tomorrow." She kept her voice level, clinical, the way she'd been trained to present information to command. It was a suggestion, not a challenge. Just data. Just pattern recognition. Hargrove stopped mid-stride. He turned slowly, deliberately, his eyes moving from the chart to her face with the calculated precision of someone preparing to make an example. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough that every resident, every nurse within 15 feet, heard every word. "Nurse Ross, I wasn't aware you'd completed a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship between yesterday and today. Or are you one of those nurses who watches YouTube and thinks she's ready for the operating room?" He smiled while saying it. The smile was the worst part. It made the words feel rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in his bathroom mirror, waiting for a moment exactly like this. The 2 residents shifted their weight uncomfortably. I suddenly focused on their shoes or the monitor screens, anywhere but on her face. Danielle took one measured breath. When she spoke, her voice had dropped into something quieter, something colder. "I'm simply reading the numbers, doctor." "The numbers?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a patronizing purr that somehow carried more weight than his shout. "How about you read your scope of practice instead, Leave the thinking to people with medical degrees. That's what you're here for, isn't it? Following orders. Not giving them." He turned back to the colonel without waiting for a response, and that was the calculation, he didn't need her to respond. The silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a third-year named Chen, looked like he wanted to say something, but Hargrove had already moved on, and the moment passed. Danielle wrote nothing in the chart. She didn't argue. She didn't defend the clinical observation she'd made. She simply stood there, jaw tight enough that a muscle in her cheek jumped once, then held still. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours later, the colonel's adult daughter arrived for her afternoon vigil. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been sleeping in the chair beside her father's bed since his admission, refusing to go home, refusing to leave him alone with the machines and the quiet hum of the ICU. She was reaching for a cup of coffee when Hargrove entered the room for his examination, Danielle following 2 steps behind with the vital signs printout. The interaction took 90 seconds. Hargrove checked the colonel's lungs, ordered a repeat EKG, made a note in the electronic record. Standard stuff. But then he straightened, turned toward Sarah, and let his voice fill the small room. "I apologize for Nurse Ross here. She has a tendency to overstep, think she knows more than she does. Some nurses forget they're here to follow orders, not give them. We'll be assigning someone more appropriate to your father's care going forward. Someone who understands the hierarchy." His eyes flicked toward Danielle, then back to Sarah, and his expression suggested she should feel reassured by this information. That her father was being protected from an incompetent subordinate. Sarah's face shifted. She looked at Danielle, then back at Hargrove, clearly uncomfortable but unsure whether to say anything. "I thought Nurse Ross was excellent. She was the one who—" "Of course she was," Hargrove interrupted smoothly. "She's adequate at the basic tasks. It's the independent thinking that's the problem." He moved toward the door, stopping to note Sarah's name in his mental file, a family member who had bonded with the staff. Someone he'd need to manage. Danielle was still standing at the monitor, checking the colonel's telemetry, her hands moving through the motions with mechanical precision. She wiped at a spot on the screen that didn't need wiping. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't respond. Her jaw was tight enough that her teeth ached, but her voice, when she finally spoke to Sarah, was steady and professional. "Your father's doing really well. The drain is working beautifully." It wasn't a lie. The data supported it. The colonel was improving. She could see it in his sinus rhythm, in his oxygen saturation, in the slope of the trend lines on every screen surrounding his bed. Sarah reached out and touched her shoulder as she passed, a small gesture of solidarity that Danielle felt like a fist to the chest, because accepting kindness from this woman meant accepting that Hargrove had been cruel, and acknowledging cruelty meant acknowledging that she'd been wounded by it, and she couldn't afford to be wounded. Not here. Not now. Not when her death certificate was filed somewhere in a Pentagon basement and 3 senators needed her to stay buried. The break room exile began at lunch. Danielle entered with her packed meal, a container of rice and grilled chicken she'd prepared at 5 a.m. in her apartment, the same meal she ate every day, the same routine that meant she didn't have to interact with anyone, didn't have to make small talk, didn't have to exist in the social ecosystem of the hospital. She sat at the corner table where she always sat, the one near the window that overlooked the parking lot. For exactly 43 seconds, the room was normal. Then the coordinated retreat began. Nurse Martinez, who'd been friendly since Danielle's first week, suddenly remembered she needed to check something in the supply room. The 2 nurses from night shift who were grabbing coffee before leaving gathered their things. Even Janet from pediatrics, who usually sat reading her phone, abruptly decided she had work to do upstairs. Their chairs scraped back in a choreographed pattern, like they'd rehearsed it. Their eyes didn't meet hers. They simply left, and Danielle sat alone at a table meant for 6, her fork making small sounds against her container. Young Nurse Martinez hesitated at the door. Danielle could see the internal conflict playing across her face, the desire to stay versus the fear of retaliation. Then Hargrove appeared in the doorway behind her, silhouetted against the hallway light, and made eye contact with Martinez. Just eye contact. No words. The message was clear: stay, and you'll pay the price. Martinez's shoulders sagged, and she left without looking back. Danielle finished her meal in silence. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't ball up her napkin and throw it across the room in frustration. She simply existed in the isolation like it was oxygen, like loneliness was a climate she'd learned to survive in a long time ago. Because it was. In the field hospitals of Helmand Province, in the extraction zones where you couldn't make friends because your friends were taken from you, in the years since 2019 when she'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life and never surface, isolation was familiar. It was safe. It was the absence of connection that kept people alive. That evening, the notice appeared on the unit board. Hargrove's handwriting was neat, precise, the letters perfectly formed, the handwriting of a man who did everything deliberately, including this. The write-up was detailed enough to be damning but vague enough to be defensible. N. Ross, practicing outside scope, insubordinate behavior during rounds, undermining physician authority. Formal warning issued. Effective immediately. Every nurse walking past that board on their way to the break room could read it. Danielle watched them pause, read the words, and move on. She watched their faces process the information. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked unsurprised. None of them said anything. At 6 o'clock, as her shift was ending, maintenance arrived with a cart. The supervisor, a man named David who'd always been kind to her, who'd helped her find her locker on her first day, wouldn't make eye contact. "It's nothing personal," he said, his voice uncomfortable. "Space reorganization. We're moving your locker to the basement level. Better use of the square footage up here." She was the only one being moved. Danielle carried her belongings down 2 flights of stairs. Her shoes echoed on the concrete steps. The basement was colder than the hospital floors above it, the air different, stale and recycled and carrying an undertone of something chemical. Formaldehyde. The morgue doors were 20 feet from where they'd placed her new locker, tucked into a corner near the laundry facilities. The fluorescent lights down here didn't hum, they flickered, the electrical current unstable, casting everything in a sickly alternating glow. This was where she belonged now. This was where Hargrove wanted her to be, underground, out of sight, among the dead. She placed her few belongings on the shelf, a change of scrubs, a spare stethoscope, a small mirror, a photograph of nothing in particular. Then she locked the door and stood there in the cold basement light, letting the isolation settle over her like a familiar coat. What she didn't know was that Hargrove wasn't finished. Not even close. That same evening, from his office on the 5th floor, he made the first call. His fraternity brother, Richard Kellerman, chairman of the hospital board and a man who'd learned long ago that friendship meant reciprocal favors. The phone rang twice before Kellerman answered, and Hargrove wasted no time with pleasantries. "Richard, I need to discuss a personnel matter. I have an employee, Danielle Ross, floor nurse on ICU, who's presenting some real concerns." Thin background. 3 years here, some references from Virginia, but before that? Nothing. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. She's demonstrated insubordinate behavior, practiced outside her scope, and I'm starting to wonder if her credentials are even legitimate. He paused, letting the implication settle. "I'm going to need board support for termination. I want this done right, but I want it done." Kellerman, whose entire worldview was organized around the principle that powerful men helped other powerful men, agreed without hesitation. "Whatever you need, Vince. I'll make sure there's no resistance when you move forward." The second call went to Margaret Chen, Hargrove's former residency director at Duke, now chair of the hiring committee at University Hospital in Durham. This conversation was more refined, the same information, but delivered as professional advice rather than personal favor. "Margaret, I'm calling as a professional courtesy. If a Danielle Ross applies to your institution, background in nursing, possibly with credentials from Virginia, I'd recommend flagging her file. Reckless judgment, insubordination, possible falsification of credentials. I'm doing you a favor here, colleague to colleague." 3 more calls followed. Chapel Hill. Charlotte. Virginia Beach. The same script. The same poison dripped into the ears of everyone who could influence where she might work. By the time Danielle clocked out at 11 o'clock that night, Hargrove had activated a network that extended across 100 miles, a web of institutional power designed to ensure that she would never be hired anywhere again. During her night shift, while Hargrove slept in his home in the suburbs, Danielle sat at the colonel's bedside during her final rounds. His morphine drip was running at the correct rate. His vitals were stable. His oxygen saturation was 96%. Everything was holding. She checked his telemetry, made a note in the chart, and was about to leave when he stirred. His morphine haze was thick, he was somewhere between sleep and fever dream, his eyes flickering behind closed lids, his mouth moving without sound. Then, soft enough that she almost missed it, a voice like wind through a canyon. "Angel 6. Her hand froze on his wrist. His pulse jumped under her fingers, and she couldn't tell if it was his heart rate spiking or her own pulse hammering in her throat, transmitted through her touch. Angel 6. No one had called her that name in 5 years. No one alive, anyway. She looked at his left forearm. There it was, barely visible in the fluorescent light, a tattoo in faded ink, a combat medic star with A6 inscribed inside. The same tattoo that had been there the last time she'd seen him, in a ditch outside San Gin Valley with his femur shattered and his lung collapsing, his blood on her uniform and her hands and ground into the canvas of her boots. That was a different war. A different lifetime. A timeline where Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had existed in more than just her own memory. The Colonel's eyes didn't focus. He was lost in the morphine clouds, calling out to ghosts. Angel 6? His voice was a question now, uncertain. Danielle stepped back from the bed. She adjusted his full line, checked his monitor one more time, and left him there in the dark, calling for someone who was supposed to be dead. She couldn't remind him who she was. She couldn't risk the connection, the recognition, the moment when his eyes would clear and he'd realize he'd been saved by a ghost. 3 senators needed her to stay buried. The Pentagon had filed her death certificate. The orders had been clear: disappear into civilian life and never surface. She walked away from his bedside before the memories could pull her under. The Colonel's cardiac monitor began its warning at 2:51 a.m. Not the gentle ding of routine alerts, but a sustained shriek that split the ICU silence like a blade through silk. Danielle was 2 rooms away, restocking a crash cart with a mechanical precision that came from muscle memory older than her civilian life, when she heard it. The sound cut through her chest before her conscious mind could process the numbers. Pericardial effusion. The Colonel's heart was drowning inside its own sac, pressure compressing against the chambers, squeezing the life out of every beat. She moved before the thought completed itself, boots on tile, rapid fire, no hesitation, and she was through his doorway while the first-year resident was still fumbling with his phone, pale as the linoleum, pressing the receiver to his ear with trembling fingers. Cardiothoracic surgery, now, the resident was saying, his voice climbing toward panic. Post-operative Colonel with acute tamponade, pressure dropping, O2 sat 91 and falling, we need. The Colonel's lips had taken on a blue tint that spoke of peripheral hypoperfusion. His daughter stood frozen in the doorway, both hands pressed to her mouth, and Danielle made a tactical decision in the span of a heartbeat: ignore her, don't make promises, move. The monitor continued its electronic scream, BP 68/42 and dropping, heart rate 134, irregular, the kind of electrical chaos that meant the end was arriving in minutes, not hours. The resident's voice shook as he listened to the response on the other end of the line. They're 20 minutes out, minimum. Maybe 30 with traffic. He looked at Danielle, and she could read the calculation happening behind his eyes, the young doctor understanding, for perhaps the first time in his career, that protocols were written for ideal circumstances and this was not an ideal circumstance. He doesn't have 20 minutes, Danielle said. Already her hands were moving the crash cart into position, already she was reading the ultrasound machine's boot sequence. Not a request. Not a question. Simple transmission of medical reality. She'd calculated the time it took for a collapsing ventricle to progress to cardiogenic shock, 11 minutes in her experience, sometimes less. She'd calculated the fluid volume necessary to create this compression, the entry point that would provide the fastest decompression, the depth of the needle at her available landmarks. She'd done this 17 times before in field conditions with equipment scavenged from a destroyed clinic in San Gin Valley, Helmand Province, with no ultrasound, no monitors, just her hands and the feel of fluid resistance against the needle tip and a soldier bleeding out with each heartbeat. The unit phone crackled. Hargrove's voice came through like static made solid, like authority distilled into sound waves. What's the status on that patient? The resident's eyes flicked to Danielle, then back to the monitors. Acute tamponade, sir. Dr. Chowdhury is responding but... Is Senior Chief in that room? Hargrove's voice carried an edge that cut deeper than any physical blade. Danielle kept her movement steady, precise. The ultrasound probe was already warm. She positioned it, found the pericardial sac, the dark shadow of accumulated blood, approximately 240 milliliters, she estimated, enough to choke a heart. The daughter made a sound like a small animal caught in a trap. Danielle didn't look at her. Looking at family members was a luxury, a moment of human connection that civilians could afford. She couldn't. "Yes, sir," the resident said quietly. "Do not let that nurse touch him." Hargrove's voice had lowered, become something more dangerous than raised, the calm of a man secure in his authority. "I want this explicitly clear. No pericardiocentesis. You wait for Chowdhury. You wait for me. That is a direct order. Chart it." The liability. Danielle disconnected the phone mid-sentence. The resident stared at her like she'd just committed mutiny. She had. She was aware of it with the clarity that came from having committed far worse things in far worse places. "Document that I acted against explicit physician orders," she told him, and her voice had shifted, dropped an octave, lost all the habitual deference she'd cultivated like a second skin at Oak Creek. This was the voice she'd used in tactical briefings, the voice that made other people move. Chart the times, the vital signs, the reasoning. Everything. Include Dr. Hargrove's order and the timestamp he gave it. The resident grabbed a pen, started writing with the focus of a man racing against a clock that was already winning. His hand shook, but his documentation was precise. Oak Creek Memorial floor nurses were trained on charting, and in this moment that training was the only thing that mattered. The colonel's pressure dropped further, 60/38. His oxygen sat fell to 87. The color was draining from his face like sand through an hourglass. Danielle's hands didn't shake as she prepped the procedural field. The 14-gauge needle lay waiting in its sterile package, and she performed this exact sequence enough times that her nervous system knew the choreography better than her conscious mind. She'd done it while IED explosions rattled windows in buildings 3 blocks away. She'd done it in darkness lit only by chemalights and the burning hulk of a Humvee. She'd done it with a dying man's blood on her uniform and the sound of small arms fire close enough to make the air vibrate. She could certainly do it in a temperature-controlled ICU with proper lighting and people watching instead of trying to kill her. The ultrasound image was clean and clear, the effusion was moderate, accessible, compressing the right atrium with the visual signature of acute tamponade. She marked the entry point, felt the cool acetone of the chlorhexidine antiseptic against her skin as she prepped. The resident moved closer, understanding now that he was witnessing something, that his job was no longer to manage the crisis but to document the person managing it. "You'll lose your job," he whispered. Danielle looked at him directly. There was a question in his eyes, a question about who she was, what gave her the certainty to override a senior physician, the calm that came not from arrogance but from someplace deeper, older, more weathered. She answered it with a single sentence, "I've lost more than that before." Then she turned to the monitor, to the task, to the life that was counting on muscle memory that belonged to a woman who'd officially been dead for 5 years. The needle advanced. The colonel flinched, his eyes flickering open for just a moment, blue eyes trying to focus through the fog of hypoxia and shock. Danielle watched his face carefully, not for pain, but for the subtle signs that the needle was positioned correctly. Pain was information. She'd learned that lesson in a field hospital in Kandahar with a shattered leg and the understanding that screaming would get her fellow soldiers killed. Then the needle entered the pericardial sac. The resistance changed, the distinctive give of tissue and fluid, the subtle shift in pressure that told her she was exactly where she needed to be. She advanced the catheter another centimeter, and dark red blood began drawing back into the syringe. 212 milliliters by the time she stopped, the pericardial space decompressing with each withdrawal, the pressure on the colonel's heart releasing like a fist unclenching. The monitor changed. The chaotic rhythm smoothed. The heart rate dropped from 134 to 108, then 98. The blood pressure climbed, 70/44, then 78/50, then 82/52. The oxygen saturation rose from 87 to 91 to 94 to 96. The colonel's lips regained their normal color, the blue receding like a tide going out. His daughter made a noise that wasn't quite speech, a sound of release, of fear transforming into something softer. The second nurse at the bedside, Marianne, who'd come in to check before placement, had witnessed the entire sequence. She stood frozen for a moment, then moved to the monitor, confirming the readings with the expression of someone who'd just watched a medical miracle unfold in room for 10. The resident kept writing, his pen moving fast across the chart, timestamps and vital signs and the specific notation, pericardiocentesis performed by floor nurse Ross, RN, against explicit physician order from Dr. Hargrove, approximately 212 milliliters aspirated, immediate hemodynamic improvement, patient stable. Danielle disposed of the needle with the efficiency of someone who'd disposed of far more dangerous things. She removed the sterile field. She stepped back from the bed with a single movement that looked casual to anyone not trained to read the language of combat-efficient motion. The colonel's daughter moved forward now, reaching for Danielle's shoulder, her hands trembling with the force of gratitude and shock, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "He's stable," Danielle said quietly. "Dr. Chowdhury will be here in 15 minutes. Document everything you saw." This last was for both nurses, Marianne and the resident whose name she'd already forgotten, the way she forgot civilian details that had no tactical relevance. They nodded. They understood now that they'd been taught something beyond hospital protocol. They'd been taught that sometimes the hierarchy was wrong, that sometimes the person with the lowest title had the highest skill, that sometimes surviving meant breaking the rules. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, normal sinus rhythm, the most beautiful sound in any ICU, the sound of a heart that wasn't drowning anymore. Danielle walked back toward the door, and the colonel's eyes opened wider, clearer now as the oxygen returned to his brain, returned to consciousness. For just a moment their eyes met. For just a moment she saw something flicker in his face, a question, a fragment of recognition, a memory that the morphine and the weeks of recovery had almost buried. His lips moved like he was trying to say something, to form a word. Then Hargrove's footsteps hit the corridor outside, rapid and furious, and Danielle was already moving toward the exit, her composure settling back into place like a mask, her voice shifting back down into the deferential register of a floor nurse, her hands, those hands that had just saved a life, folded calmly at her sides as the attending physician threw open the door with the expression of a man who'd just received a status report that contradicted his explicit orders. Hargrove's footsteps stopped cold at the ICU threshold. The colonel lay stable in bed 12, chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, the ventilators hiss keeping rhythm with a heart monitor that sang a steady sinus rhythm. Danielle stood at the crash cart, her gloved hands methodical, disposing of the 14-gauge needle and the saline-stained gauze into the biohazard container. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before, somewhere else, in a place that didn't officially exist. The pericardiocentesis kit lay open on the silver tray. Evidence. Documentation. Everything Hargrove needed to see. His face went through 3 distinct shades, white to crimson to something darker, a red that belonged in a violence textbook. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Dangerous. The kind of quiet that makes rooms smaller. "What did you do?" Danielle didn't turn. She peeled off her gloves with the slow precision of someone removing a surgical mask after a 14-hour shift. The latex snapped like a gunshot in the silence. "I saved his life. You directly violated my order." Hargrove moved closer, his jaw tight as a closed fist. In front of witnesses. With his daughter present. "You aspirated blood from the pericardial sac without authorization. 212 milliliters." Danielle turned to face him, and her eyes were something different now, not the eyes of a floor nurse, but the eyes of someone who had seen worse than this office could ever contain. His O2 was at 62. Blood pressure 70/40 and dropping. He had for minutes. The colonel's daughter, Rebecca, stepped forward from where she'd been standing frozen near the bed. "She saved my father's life. He was dying. You said we had to wait for the surgeon." Hargrove's smile was a scalpel. He turned to her, and his voice became syrup, false sweetness covering something poisonous. "I apologize that you had to witness this. This reckless, dangerous, arrogant display." He gestured to Danielle like she was an exhibit in a courtroom. "She got lucky. She performed a procedure she has absolutely no authorization to perform, and if anything goes wrong in the next 48 hours, this hospital will be liable for every complication. This is exactly the kind of cowboy medicine that kills patients." One of the nurses, the younger one, still trembling from the adrenaline, made a small noise. Hargrove turned to her. You witnessed her disregard for my direct physician orders, yes? The nurse nodded, barely audible. Yes, doctor. Both of you. The second nurse nodded. 2 witnesses. 2 documented violations. Hargrove was building his case the way a mason builds a wall, methodical, immovable, constructed to last. He turned back to Danielle, and this was the moment where most people would have crumbled. This was where the tears came, where voices cracked, where fear leaked through the cracks in composure like water through a dam. Danielle breathed slowly through her nose. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Pain was information. Humiliation was data. She could process both without flinching. You, Hargrove said, pointing one manicured finger, are the kind of nurse who thinks she's smarter than doctors. Who thinks the rules don't apply to her? Who thinks she can practice medicine without a license? His voice began to climb, feeding on her stillness, her refusal to break. You endangered this patient. You violated protocol. You undermined the entire chain of command that keeps this hospital functioning. Danielle let one tear trace her cheek. Just one. Measured. Controlled. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of authority, the kind of authority that didn't come from a title on a nameplate. You have no idea what chain of command actually means, doctor. The words hung in the ICU like a threat. Like a prophecy. Hargrove's face flushed again, but he turned away. He'd already won. Or so he believed. Within the hour, Danielle was summoned to his office on the 2nd floor. The windows overlooked the parking lot, the kind of view that belonged to someone important. HR sat in the chair to the left, a woman named Cassandra Chen with the expression of someone following protocol rather than making choices. Hospital security stood behind her, 2 officers with radios on their belts and the posture of men who were there to remove things, not discuss them. The termination letter was already printed. Already signed. It lay on the mahogany desk like a verdict. This is effective immediately, Hargrove said. He didn't offer her a seat. Your badge will be deactivated. You'll be escorted to your locker to collect personal items. You may not speak with patients. You may not attempt to return to the unit. This is final. Danielle picked up the letter. The words blurred slightly, not because her vision was failing, but because she'd learned decades ago how to compartmentalize emotion into a box labeled later. She read it anyway. Insubordination. Practicing outside scope. Violation of physician orders. Endangering patient safety. Every word a lie wrapped in administrative language. When she looked up, Hargrove was leaning back in his chair, already victorious. The kind of victorious that comes from someone who has never been tested in actual combat. He thought he'd won because she wasn't screaming. He thought he'd won because she wasn't crying, well, not visibly. He thought he'd won because she was still following the rules, still being escorted out quietly, still being professional. He had no idea. I understand, Danielle said, her voice measured as a surgeon's hand. Thank you for the opportunity to serve at Oak Creek Memorial. Hargrove's smile widened. She was defeated. She was broken. She was leaving quietly. She was gone. The walk from the 2nd floor to her locker took 9 minutes. Security followed 2 steps behind, their radio silent, their presence a reminder of her status, no longer staff, now liability. Other nurses averted their eyes. A resident she'd trained last month in proper for technique pretended not to see her. The break room door stood open, and conversation stopped mid-sentence as she passed. Her locker was in the basement, near the morgue, a detail Hargrove had specifically arranged, she understood now. The locker next to the death. The locker in the dark. She packed her belongings into a cardboard box. A framed photo of her sister, her civilian sister, her only remaining family who didn't know the truth. A sweater she'd kept for the ICU's aggressive air conditioning. Her stethoscope, the good one, the Littman cardiology for she'd used for 15 years in 3 different countries and 1 parallel life. The cardboard box weighed almost nothing. The walk to her car took 4 minutes. The parking lot stretched out in the afternoon sun, asphalt shimmering like water, and Danielle moved through it with the kind of composure that comes from having walked out of worse places at gunpoint. Security watched from the hospital entrance. Hargrove watched from his second-floor window, already dialing numbers, already poisoning wells, already making calls to 3 state networks of connected physicians, already setting in motion the machinery that would ensure she never worked in medicine again. She didn't know that yet. She wouldn't know that for another 3 hours, when the private investigator would hit his first dead end, a social security number that barely registered, references that led nowhere, records that stopped cold in 2019 like someone had taken a knife and cut them clean. She wouldn't know that Hargrove would spend the night on the phone, growing more frustrated as the investigator reported back, "This woman either doesn't exist, or someone very powerful made her disappear." She wouldn't know that Hargrove's final instruction would be, "Then we'll make her reappear, and we'll bury her again." But she knew something else. Something that made her hand steady as she set the cardboard box on the passenger seat of her 10-year-old Honda Civic. Something that made her turn the key and pull out of the parking lot without looking back. Something that lived in the muscle memory of her shoulders, in the way her spine remained straight, in the absolute clarity that the worst thing that could happen to her had already happened 4 years ago, and she'd survived that by becoming invisible. Being visible again, for just a few hours, had saved a man's life. The cost was worth measuring. She drove to her apartment in silence, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her breathing regulated and precise. The radio stayed off. The phone stayed dark. This was compartmentalization. The professional nurse had been fired. The civilian woman would figure out what came next. The problem was that somewhere between those 2 identities lived the woman who couldn't actually be fired, because officially she didn't exist. The woman whose real rank carried weight across 3 military branches. The woman whose call sign, the one tattooed on a Delta Force colonel's forearm, was about to be spoken aloud in places she couldn't control. 23 hours and 47 minutes after her badge was deactivated, the rotor wash from 2 Black Hawks would rattle the windows of Oak Creek Memorial. 30 seconds after that, everything would change. But for now, Danielle drove home in silence, a cardboard box of her civilian life sitting on the passenger seat, unaware that her other life, the one the Pentagon had ordered her to forget, was already in motion. Unaware that the rules she'd been following for 4 years were about to be rewritten by people with authority far above hospital administrators. Unaware that being invisible was about to become impossible. The next 24 hours belonged entirely to Hargrove. He sat in his office at 6:13 a.m., before the sun crested the oak trees outside his window, and made the first call. His voice was honey-smooth, a man with nothing to lose, which made him most dangerous. "Margaret, it's Vince. Listen, I need to talk to you about a candidate who applied to Durham Regional. Danielle Ross. Nurse." The pause on the other end was just long enough. He continued, "Yeah, her references looked solid, but I had some concerns about her clinical judgment. Overstepped scope. I'd hate to see that become a problem in your facility." By noon, he'd called 17 hospitals across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. Each call was calibrated differently. For some he emphasized her recklessness, for others her arrogance. For a select few he dropped the same poison in the form of a casual question: did she mention any gaps in her work history? The words hung like bait. At 1:15 p.m., he contacted the North Carolina Board of Nursing. The complaint form was meticulous, 3 pages, falsified incident reports, dates that didn't match actual shifts, allegations that she'd administered medications without physician orders, that she'd refused to follow proper chain of command. He signed his name with a title that still meant something, at least in writing. His fraternity brother Richard Kellerman received an urgent email marked confidential at 3:42 p.m. "We need to discuss the Ross termination. Legal exposure." Hargrove knew the tone would drive Richard toward the phone. And it did. The private investigator he'd hired, a former cop named Mercer with a reputation for discretion, received his final payment authorization, $50,000 to find something, anything, that would justify permanent destruction of her career. Dig into her background. Find the gaps. Find the lies. There were gaps. Hargrove had sensed them the moment she'd started, too polished in some ways, too quiet in others, a military bearing that didn't match her paperwork. References from 2019 onward suddenly appeared with no prior employment history. It was wrong. It was suspicious. And Mercer had the kind of connections to find what was hidden. But what happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended something far larger than one nurse's career. At 4:24 p.m., two UH-60M Black Hawks banked hard over the Raleigh skyline, their rotor wash shaking windows across a 3-block radius of downtown. They landed in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot in perfect formation, dust and disturbed grass scattering like a warning. Security guards who'd worked hospitals for 30 years suddenly understood what actual authority sounded like. 24 personnel moved in coordinated silence from the helicopters, combat fatigues, tactical load-bearing vests, the kind of weapons that made standard hospital security look like decoration. They walked through the emergency department doors like men who didn't need permission, and the charge nurse at the desk felt something in her body respond before her mind caught up. Fear or respect? Both. "We're looking for Senior Chief Ross," the lead officer said. His voice was calm. His eyes were not. "By that call sign." Not her legal name. "That one." The hospital went still. Fluorescent lights seemed suddenly loud. Phone stopped ringing. A child in the waiting room asked his mother why everyone was frozen, and she had no answer. Security scrambled. Floor supervisors pulled files. Administrators materialized like ghosts summoned by the invocation of a rank that shouldn't exist inside a civilian hospital, senior chief. Not nurse. Chief. Danielle's personnel file was hastily retrieved from the archive, stamped inactive, dusty with the weight of 24 hours since her termination. Hospital Administrator Julia Ling held the folder with hands that had begun to tremble. The colonel emerged from the third-floor ICU, moving with the grace of a man whose body had been reassembled by surgeons and time. Clear eyes. No morphine fog. No confusion. He wore a visitor's credential and a shirt that hung loose over a healing chest, and when he reached the lobby, the Delta Force team parted like water around stone. Behind him came two officers with insignias that made the hospital's entire chain of command suddenly feel very small. Navy SEAL commanders. The kind of men who ran operations that officially never happened, who had the kind of authority that came from presidents instead of hospital boards. "This is Colonel Marcus Reed, 1st SFOD Delta," the lead SEAL said, voice carrying through the atrium like a command. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross saved his life in 2019. During an operation that doesn't exist. He paused. "Let that sit." She then saved his life again, 3 days ago, in your ICU. Without authorization. Against direct orders from Dr. Hargrove. The colonel stepped forward. "I know her by call sign only. Angel 6. She carried me 11 miles through Helmand Province with a collapsed lung and a shattered femur. She did the same thing here. She didn't ask permission. She acted. And I'm alive because of it." The second SEAL commander took a half-step forward. His voice was quiet, which made it more powerful. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross holds 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Silver Stars. She saved 17 lives during classified operations. And she's been living as a ghost in your hospital for 4 years." He looked directly at Julia Ling. "You just fired a decorated war hero for doing her job." The silence was so complete you could hear the ventilation system breathing. Hargrove stood on the second-floor balcony. He'd come down when the commotion started and felt something essential drain from his body. He watched the colonel point to the pericardiocentesis needle entry site on his chest, now just a small circular scar, and heard him say, "This is the mark of a chief. Not a nurse. A chief." The words carried the weight of military bearing, of medals and operations, and authority that existed entirely beyond the scope of hospital politics. Julia Ling's voice was steady when she spoke, though her hand still held the folder like a lifeline. Dr. Hargrove. My office. Now. But Hargrove was already frozen on the balcony, and within the hour, the machinery he'd activated began consuming him instead. Mercer, the private investigator, called at 5:03 p.m. His voice was tight, and he whispered like someone checking over his shoulder. I'm out. All of it. Whatever you asked me to dig into, it triggered flags in 3 separate federal databases. FBI. NCIS. Something else I don't have a name for. He paused. The sound of papers shuffling. I just got a call. Man didn't identify himself. Just said, destroy all files. Forget the job. Don't call anyone. I'm destroying all files. Forgetting the job. The line went dead. Richard Kellerman's email arrived at 5:56 p.m. Vince, we need to talk. In person. Not by email. This morning. And bring a lawyer. The hospitals began calling back. Margaret from Durham Regional, her voice tight with something like fear. Vince, what the hell did you get me involved in? 2 men in suits showed up at my office this afternoon asking why I flagged someone as a potential liability. They asked if I had documentation of my hiring concerns. They asked if I'd received any communications from you that might have constituted professional interference. Do not call me again. By 9 p.m., the North Carolina Board of Nursing had officially withdrawn the investigation into Danielle Ross and opened a separate inquiry into Dr. Vincent Hargrove for filing a knowingly false complaint, a violation that could result in permanent loss of reporting credentials. By morning, an emergency hospital board meeting convened without Hargrove present. Legal counsel reviewed his pattern, the retaliation, the coordinated calls to rival hospitals, the fabricated board complaints, the systematic isolation. They reviewed his decision to order a nurse to wait while a patient exsanguinated. They reviewed the witnesses, 2 residents and a family member, who had documented his refusal to allow intervention. The colonel's daughter gave her statement to the board. Dr. Hargrove treated my father like his medical property. He treated the person who saved his life like she was the problem. Nurse Martinez, finally free from the fear of retaliation, filed a formal complaint detailing years of intimidation, credit stealing, and systematic humiliation of competent nurses. 3 others followed. Then 5 more. Legal counsel advised immediate suspension. The board voted unanimously at 11:51 a.m. At 2:15 p.m., the same security guard who had escorted Danielle from the building 4 days earlier approached Hargrove's office with an identical cardboard box, empty, waiting to be filled. His voice was flat, professional, final. Doctor, I believe you know the way out. 6 months later, someone spotted Vincent Hargrove teaching CPR certification courses at a community college in Fayetteville. He wore a polo shirt with the college logo, not a white coat. His hands demonstrated chest compressions to 19-year-olds who had no idea he'd once run an ICU, no idea he'd once held the power of life and death, no idea he'd tried to destroy someone he couldn't understand. His medical license remained suspended. His network had evaporated. The senators didn't take his calls. The board members were unavailable. But Danielle Ross stood on the helipad at Oak Creek Memorial in full dress blues, ribbons blazing in 3 rows of color and metal, the Navy Cross catching the morning sun like a promise kept. The same nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room now stood at attention below, and Nurse Martinez saluted through tears. Julia Ling had spent 6 months trying to make amends, a formal apology, reinstatement with back pay, a promotion to clinical educator, but Danielle had already moved beyond that. She had somewhere else to be. The Secretary of Defense waited at Bethesda Naval Hospital with a question about training the next generation of combat medics, about teaching without hiding, about finally wearing the uniform that had always been hers. The colonel stood beside her, fully recovered, his daughter holding his arm. He saluted as the helicopter's rotors began their familiar song. I carried your call sign for 4 years not knowing if Angel 6 was alive or dead, he said. Now I know you were saving lives the whole time. Danielle allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind that comes from 4 years of restraint finally released. The uniform never mattered, Colonel. The oath did. The helicopter lifted, and she looked down one last time at Oak Creek Memorial, at the basement locker near the morgue, at the break room where she'd eaten alone, at the ICU where she'd broken every rule for the right reason. The worn combat boots she'd carried from 2019 were finally gone, replaced by polished dress blues and the authority to stop hiding. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. She was going home. Not to a past life, but to a future where she didn't have to choose between her oath and her identity. She was finally going home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to, like this video and subscribe for more stories about heroes living in plain sight.